guess it's about time to get started. Any questions about anything in the world? Any questions? I guess it was the quietest weekend we've had for a while, I think, financially. I don't think any particularly unusual news happening. Any questions about anything from last time when we finished talking about options pricing and things like that? Okay. Any questions about, so right now, if I understand where we are in the course, we spent the first 6 weeks or so talking about, lectures talking about how to price options. And by now everybody should, I put a gun to their head and said price an option, in principle, I think everyone here should know how to do it. And in fact, we're sort of doing that by having that be homework 1. Okay? Has anybody gotten started on homework 1 yet? Okay. I see no. Okay, let's wait here. Any question? Any reaction to homework 1? That's due in a week from today. Okay, and the purpose of the assignment is to basically go and price options. Okay, and has anybody looked at it? Any questions or comments about it? Again, I don't think I think it's an interesting assignment. I hope. Okay, I don't think it's incredibly difficult. But it is one of these things that because there are experiments involved, okay, it pays to get something done early, just sort of to convince yourself that it at least grossly makes sense before the next class period. Any questions about the assignment or what you're supposed to do with options pricing? Okay. If that's true, then we're now going to shift gears from options pricing to our next topic, which has to do with financial time series. And in time series analysis, again, why do we care about time series? Basically one way to think about it, whenever you think of a series of prices, okay, that is a time series. Whenever you think of a time series of sales data, okay, how much sales did a company make in a month, that is a time series. When you think of how many rabbits there are in a particular environment, that is as a function of time. That is a time series. When you think about the temperature over time is a time series. Mercifully, here in Hong Kong, it has gotten a lot cooler lately. Okay, and that represents this thing. So time series data arise in lots of different scientific applications, in lots of and inherently in the financial stuff that we're dealing with. Because a lot of the processes that we've been talking about in here end up generating time series. And in fact, in your first homework assignment, you have to do a little bit of non-trivial time series analysis. What is the time series part of what you have to do? Okay, pricing the options. I gave you guys price data. And one of the things that you have to do is to compute volatility. Okay? And so one example of, let's say, which is maybe a very important example of time series analysis of the type that we're going to be doing in here, would be taking as input the price stream and as output giving us the computing a volatility estimate from that. Any questions? Any questions from anybody who just came in maybe about homework 1? Any people start on homework 1 yet? Which is due a week from today. Okay? Nobody, everybody's calling a bluff. Okay? Okay, but nonetheless, it is due a week from today. Any questions? Okay. So let's talk about, again, these are sort of, again, these are sort of classic time series I show up here, both of which happen to be periodic. One is the classic example of someone measured the amount of rabbits in a particular environment as a function of years. And they found that this is what happened to the rabbit population. It went up and down. Okay? And one of the issues, of course, with time series analysis is quantifying an event. Okay? That's what collecting that data is. One of it is explaining why the data looked like that. Does anyone know why the amount of rabbits in this Canadian woods oscillated like that? Okay? The population of rabbits. Okay? And the answer was, it seemed that when they plotted the population of wolves, okay, it oscillated in the opposite direction. Okay, when there are a lot of rabbits, okay, the wolves reproduce, they eat the rabbits. Okay, the rabbits go down, then the wolves starve. Okay, and so you end up getting these periodicities. And explaining that kind of thing, identifying that phenomenon and explaining it is a time series thing. Again, when you look at weather data, weather data is an interesting thing to quantify. And making sense of that kind of time series data is an important thing. Everyone in the world has heard about the problem of global warming. And one of the first, let's say, most fundamental time series questions is the world warming? Okay? And part of it is, there's still people who debate this kind of a question. And why do they debate it? Well, you can measure the temperature as a function of time. And you compare, you can do a graph and see whether the graph looks like it's going up. But detecting whether a trend like that is a long-term trend, an anomalous trend, a momentary fluctuation, okay? This is why somehow trend analysis and time series analysis is not always trivial. Okay? Any questions? Again, for financial data, what we're mostly interested in is, it has to do with prices. Okay? But there are other time series that you end up getting, okay, that are relevant in financial analysis. Things like the unemployment rate, okay? That is a time series. Let's say the number unemployed or the unemployment rate as a function of time is an example of a time series that has economic impact, or any other, economic indicators. Sales data for a company, okay, will have, clearly has economic impact. The graph here I saw was an interesting graph about the amount of sales of oil filters for tractors as a function of time. And what it shows is that somehow that there's a period of time when, if you look at it this way, oil filter sales spike. Okay, and it turned out to be in January of every year. That's somehow when people had to order their oil filters in order to get their tractors ready to go and do their thing for each year. And so when analyzing certain time series, you have to worry about, the fact that there are these regular irregularities, seasonal fluctuations, all kinds of other fluctuations. And making sense of that data is one reason why time series is an interesting subject. Any questions? So we're going to talk here about time series analysis. As far as resources for it to go, there is some of this material will be in Hull's book. There's some areas of the Dart processes and things like that. A book that I sort of like that is on reserve in the library is this book by Tsay on the analysis of financial time series. And I think this is on reserve in the library if people want to take a look at it. The other thing that I can tell you is that there is a book that is available electronically if you're a Hong Kong student here, okay, by Cryer and Chen. If you look, there's a link to it from the course webpage now, okay? And so if you're interested in getting some resources on time series analysis of the type that we're going to be doing in here, I recommend you look at one of those books. Any questions? Or only questions about why financial time series is important or relevant to what we're doing here? Okay. Now, when we talk about time series data here, there's, as we'll see when we talk about it a little later, there's computer science-y kind of approaches to time series data analysis. But there's also sort of, time series data has probably been most intensively studied by statisticians. And the statistical tools that they talk about, okay, is what we're really going to be concentrating on here most of the time. Okay? Things like what kind of underlying models can you derive from data. But again, there's different ways of looking at time series. Many of you, when you think about time series analysis with finances, will think about technical analysis of stocks. Okay? You'll see, okay, that a stock price does this. Can we predict the future of it based on the shape of the curve? Okay? We'll talk later about technical analysis in the third part of the course when we talk about sort of trading strategies. Okay? But basically the idea somehow is still based on, in some sense, reminiscent of what we're doing. Given as input a time course, trying to make a prediction or a model or a forecast about the future. Okay? Any questions? So time series analysis, I'll claim, is clearly an important thing, and we'll go through it. Okay. So first question I have here, is there anybody here who has ever, in the course of anything in their research life or professional life or anything like that, ever dealt with time series data? Someone in here must have in the course of something they did. Yes, what did you do? What? Human voice. Okay, that's an interesting one. Okay, so in human voice, what you're saying is that you digitize something in a microphone. Okay, and that you hear me talking, and you hear, my voice signal is going to be doing something like this thing, and you'd like to be able to look at my voice and do some processing on and some analysis. Maybe you realize that this is boring, something like that. Okay, and so that's an example of time series analysis. Is there anybody else here who's ever had a dealt with some level of time series data? Okay, in the course of any project or anything like this. Okay, I do some work in my honest research area has been computational biology. Okay, bioinformatics, and there you often have an experimental time courses where you're measuring a gene. The expression of a gene is a function of time. Okay. And so you'll have some samples at different points that will measure how turned on or turned off a gene is. That's an example of time series. Any other questions? Any other examples of time series from anyone in here? In the course of a course project or anything like that. Okay? So when we deal with time series data, there's several issues that we have to think about. Okay? One is it sampled at equally spaced intervals? Some time series are sampled at equal intervals. Some time series are not. Okay? We think about the microphone analysis. Were samples made there at equal intervals? I'm going to probably guess yes. You're my expert on voice back there. Hi. Okay? Were the samples in a voice made at equal intervals? Okay, I believe the answer typically is yes. You sample a certain number of samples per second, right? In my biology experiment, it was sampled whenever they could get around to doing an experiment, okay, which would try to be as equal sampled, okay, but not always. Are stock prices sampled at equal rates, uniformly? Okay, let's think about this. If we look at the daily time course of a stock, are those sampled at equal intervals, uniform intervals? Who says yes? Who says no? Okay, why not?
Because there are weekends.
Well, one problem is that there's weekends and holidays. Is that right? Okay. So certain of the tools that you use in time series analysis assume that samples are being made at equal spaced intervals. Okay? Stock prices are sort of sampled at equal intervals, but not exactly. Okay? And so decisions have to be made when you're using it. Are you going to ignore that fact and treat it as equal or not? Is there noise or error in recording the data? Let's think about that. Okay, getting back to the microphone problem. Are there sampling errors? Okay, that when you measure in your computer that the voice level here was exactly 96.6, is that an accurate number, or might there have been a measurement error with the microphones? Yeah, so certainly whenever you have a measured number, okay, in general there's a certain level of uncertainty. Okay? And a large amount of, let's say, what you would consider to be classic engineering time series analysis has to do with filtering out noise. Okay? Because somehow if you're measuring an observed quantity, you do have noise or error. When I was looking at my biologist's experimental data on gene prediction, gene expression, certainly there was a lot of noise in sample points. And one of the questions is, important technical questions is monitoring that. In price data, are there questions of error? Okay, or is the price data, in some sense, can that be taken as correct? Okay, how many people think it's correct? Okay, how many people think that there's measurement errors involved? Okay, I would say in general that's probably not as much of an issue. Noise is not as much of an issue with price data, in that each price is what somebody actually paid for it in discrete dollars and things like that. So if there were, there's no measurement error particularly there. So that's something that probably does not arise in financial data, in stock data, but it does arise in certain statistical data. Okay, one classic example is things like the unemployment rate. Okay, the government publishes statistics, certain financial statistics, like the unemployment rate. And this is something based on, let's say, a number of claims that were filed, or something like this. Each month, claims filed for unemployment. What the government will typically do is they'll publish the data for what the unemployment rate is. And then a month later or a week later, they will adjust it. Because often they will have more or better data to get a more accurate value here. So certainly there are issues that there probably are noise in certain economic variables that we look at. But it's different than measured engineering variables. Yeah?
So why does it allow, why don't we allow what we make? Why does it allow twice?
Well, so the question is, why do they announce the unemployment rate twice then? The argument would be that people want, you're trying to steer the economy or get a sense of what's going on. The earlier you can get the data about what's going on, the better. Okay? Of course, you want, and sometimes what you would like whenever you want any kind of a data source, you'd like it as quickly as possible and as accurately as possible. Okay? And in the case of unemployment rate, that gives you a good, right now people are very concerned about the unemployment rate. Because when people are unemployed, they don't get paid salaries and they don't spend as much, they don't have as much money to spend. And that's a bad thing, right? Everyone's worried about the economy slowing down. The earlier indicator you can get about that thing has value. But of course, the earlier the indicator you get, the less accurate it probably will be. And so you could imagine a need for an early indicator, but then you would like to, as you can let it get more information, for historically analyzing what the unemployment really was, you would like as accurate a number. And that's probably why they have two different things. Any questions? Okay? There's all kinds of different indicators of unemployment while we're going on this thing. One recent way, historically, the way that they would measure things like unemployment would be things like counting. In the United States, when you get unemployed, you're going to file to get some payment from the government to tide you over. And so they will monitor how many claims there are. In today's internet era, there's a faster way to find that out. Google keeps track of how many times people type the word, job hunting into Google, okay? And in some sense, if you look at what, let's say, people are doing, okay, in things like search engines and stuff like that, you can get possibly quicker feedback about some of these economic variables. So again, this in some sense, this gives you another set of time series that are potentially interesting, okay? But again, what their accuracy is, how you interpret them, okay, is where, let's say, the real money or interest is in time series analysis. Any questions? Okay? One issue is how long or rapidly growing is this time series? Okay? Certain time series are very long. Okay? A good example might be the stock price of General Motors, right? Okay? Certain ones might be much shorter, like the monthly or yearly profit of Yahoo. Okay? And so trying to figure out, again, there's certain techniques that apply to very short time series. Okay? And in the case of the biology experiment that I did up here, where here every time point means I said the biologist went into the lab and spent 2 hours laboring over something. The time series that you're going to be getting to analyze are very short, 20 points long. Okay? In the case of the speech processing one, I assume that they sample maybe 4,000 samples per second or something like this. You get, after you hear me talk for a lecture like this, you've got millions of points. Okay? And so the question of, there's different techniques that apply to whether you're dealing with short time series or long time series. Okay? Any questions? Another question related to errors, are there missing values? One thing that happens in the biology experiment is perhaps when they do an experiment and they're measuring the expression of a lot of genes at a time, perhaps the guy sneezes and gets something on these parts of the experiment, and so the measurements here are going to be lost, okay, relative to other time points, and trying to figure out if there are missing values for some reason. Do you impute a value? Do you do these kind of things? There's all kinds of different answers to these kind of experiment questions, but basically, different time series data has different properties, which will yield different things when we analyze it. Any questions? So with stock price time series, let's think, which is sort of, let's say, the most obvious thing that we're going to be interested in. There are interesting properties of stock prices because it is inherently a discrete, stock prices are a discrete thing, okay? They're not real, stock prices are not real numbers, okay? They're, at least in the United States, they're can be thought of as integers because stock prices are measured in pennies, okay? So, one thing to note about stock prices is, typically stock prices are given in, these days, in pennies, okay? And when you look at a stock price time series, in general, if the stock price gets too high, let's say that the stock price gets to be $1,000 or so, often a company will, for convenience, have a stock split. Okay? I don't know if we talked about splits in here. But basically what a stock split would say is, okay, if you have one of these old shares, we're going to take one of the old shares and break it into two new shares. So now the new share price is $500. But everybody who owned it before, okay, has twice as much stock. So a split like that doesn't change the value of what you hold, but it changes the nominal price of what you buy. The other end of this thing is what we call reverse splits. When the stock price drops low enough, let's say that the stock price of something drops to, let's say, 50 cents, okay? It is fairly common that they will now say, we're going to take 10 of the old shares and combine them into one new share. And the new share now has a price of $5, okay? And again, no value has been lost, okay? But it does mean that if you're interpreting a time series signal, if you see somebody's, if you just interpret somebody's time series signal of prices, ignoring splits and reverse splits, you would get misleading things. Right? Suppose we looked at that company, General Motors. You know, it went down to 75 cents, 50 cents. Suddenly it's up to $5. If you just got a price quote, you would think that suddenly something good has happened with General Motors. Okay? But of course that isn't the case. So we have to be aware of the effects of splits, reverse splits, and also dividend prices. We saw what happened when dividends are issued. Right? What happens to dividends? When a dividend is issued, the price of the stock goes down. Okay? Again, it's hard to say that the stock has been punished because of it. Okay? But we need to make sense of that if we're going to work with price data. Any questions? Now, why do they do this split and reverse split game? Okay? It's important to understand why they do it. First of all, there is no law that says that you have to split the price of the stock if it gets high enough. Okay? Many of you have heard of Warren Buffett. Okay? He's a famous investor. And his company is a company called Berkshire Hathaway. And he has a policy where he never splits the price of his stock. And he's been a very successful stock. Now to buy one share of his stock costs something like, is it $80,000 or $100,000 to buy one share of it? Okay? Now why is that a bad thing? Well, you might say it's not a bad thing because he would do it. But what's the problem with that? Okay, from an investor point of view, if the stock price gets too high. Okay? Is there any problem with this, for an investor's point of view, if you want to buy a stock whose share is too high?
It's too expensive to buy one bunch of shares, so the trading volume will be small.
Well, so the problem is now, if it costs, let's say I want to invest in his share, in his stock, but I don't have $80,000 to buy one. If the smallest quanta of stock on the market costs $80,000, you can't buy it until you have a lot of money to begin with, right? So that would be one argument for splitting it, okay? Is that it increases the ability for smaller investors or you to buy smaller amounts of stock. It makes the traffic in finer grain. Any questions? What's the argument for doing the reverse split? Why don't we want the price of a stock to get too low? Okay? Anybody figure that out? Okay? Okay, one is you may say it's depressing, okay, to see that my stock is only worth 50 cents or so. But there's a bigger reason. If I have a stock that's selling for 50 cents, what is the smallest change it can go on per share? Okay? The smallest increase it can have is 1 penny, right? At 50 cents a share, a 1 penny increase to 51 cents is a 2% swing. Does everybody see that? And if the price drops even lower, okay, then the problem is it takes a large percentage swing, a large amount. You don't have very much granularity here anymore, okay? Any questions? So that is the argument behind why these prices change, okay? Any questions? In the olden days, okay, let's say around, around the year 2000 or so, sort of in the same, grossly the same time as the year 2000 switch. The New York Stock Exchange and the American Stock Exchange switched from having the smallest movement be an eighth of a dollar, okay, or 12.5 cents, okay, down to a penny. They called that decimalization, okay? And the reason why this was a big deal is that it permitted much smaller, much finer, price changes, which in principle allows people to get fairer prices because there's no hurdle as to what it is. Any questions? It used to be when I was, used to hear stock reports, always people say, oh, it's, General Motors up an eighth, down 3/8. The reason they were doing it in eighths and stuff like that was the smallest quanta that was allowed to be changed. Now it is a penny. Any questions? So when we're dealing with price time series, the first thing that we need to do is to make sure that we properly handle dividends and splits and reverse splits. And for this reason, you will often see, and it's maybe easier to work with, things that are adjusted price time series. What is an adjusted price time series? Okay? Whenever there is a weird event, and we've defined a weird event as being a dividend issuing, or a split or a reverse split, okay? What we will do is we will then recalculate all the prices beyond that, okay? And so what an adjusted price series does is give you a time price series of what the value of your holding, that more accurately reflects the value of what your holding is. So here I show you, I don't know if people can read it, from Yahoo Finance, when you go to General Motors and you look at the monthly prices here, there is a high, a low, and a close. There is also an adjusted close. How is the adjusted close computed? Okay. Basically, the adjusted close is the same as the close, Okay? Up until the moment that the company issues a dividend. Here it issued a dividend of a quarter. Okay? The value of the stock after you've issued the dividend. Okay? Actually, where do we have it here? The value of the stock after you issue the dividend differs. Here you see the adjusted close is 23.20. The close is 23.20. The adjusted close is 22.21. Basically what happens is they go back and they recompute what the impact of the dividend is. The dividend is best interpreted by adding it back to the stock price as if you used your dividend and immediately bought some more stock. Splits and reverse splits are adjusted for properly. The only thing that's weird about this, so the good thing is if you work with the adjusted closes, historically the time series makes more sense than if you just deal with raw prices. The downside is that whenever there is one of these weird events, you have to go and adjust for everything that goes beyond it that went back in the past. Okay? And so there's a certain amount of work every time one of these events happen. Any questions? But this is what an adjusted close prices are and why they make sense. Any questions? Now, if we're going to be doing experiments with time series data on prices, okay, it turns out that the price of the asset is probably not is often not the right thing that you should be analyzing. Okay? Why is this? Well, one reason is that the price of any reasonable asset, if you take a look at any, let's say, stock that you're hoping to hold, the price of the stock should grow exponentially with time. The value of the stock should grow exponentially with time. If you start trying to work with these things, doing things like linear regression, like correlation or whatever, many of the mathematical tools that go and work with stock prices, okay, are designed to work with linear data, okay? So that's one argument against using raw prices as the thing that we need, or even adjusted prices, okay? If you have an exponentially growing series, even things like the mean. What is the mean value of your holdings? That doesn't have a whole lot over time. That doesn't have a whole lot of meaning when something is growing exponentially. Okay? So the better, let's say, statistic to compute from prices, if we're going to be doing analysis of stock prices, tends to be returns. Okay? We will say that the simple net return of a stock, okay, or an asset, is the price today over the price yesterday minus 1. Okay? Which is really just sort of the simplification of the change in prices over yesterday's price. Okay? So what makes returns interesting? What are the interesting properties of returns? First of all, the mean now of a return makes sense. If a price is unchanged, the return is what? 0, right? Okay? If the price goes up, what is the return? It's going to be positive. If the price goes down, the return is going to be negative. Okay? So one thing that's interesting is that if you now have an asset like a stock price, the returns, in some sense, are going to fluctuate around 0. Okay? Instead of, so about the same data that you're seeing here, okay, is easier to talk about. The mean return makes sense now. Okay? The data is somehow linear. That makes sense. Okay? And so returns are a nice, complete, and they call scale-free measure of investment. Okay? Any questions? By scale-free, note that dollars, there's no unit involved with it. When we looked at price was always measured in dollars. Okay? And this is now unit-free. Any questions? So returns turn out to be the right way to think about time series data for financial things. Okay? One property of returns that is nice is that if you multiply the daily, let's say, returns appropriately, okay, you will end up getting the longer term return. This is one sign that it makes sense. So if we instead take 1 plus the return that we computed before, we want to look at, let's say, the K-day return on a stock. 1 plus the K-day return, that would be the return, the price at time t minus the price K days ago. This is going to be equal to the product of 1 plus the returns, okay, the daily returns over this period. Because 1 plus the returns leaves us today over yesterday, today over yesterday. If we multiply that out, everything cancels except the first and the last term. Okay? So that's another good property of dealing with returns. Okay? It gives us the ability to multiply. Any questions? Now, when people talk about returns, okay, often people talk about them as annualized. Okay? So if you want to talk about how your stock is doing, what is the right way to think about it? If, let's say, I showed my price today, well, I bought it at $100. I sold it at $400. 7 years from now, what was my return? The right way to compute, let's say, longer term returns, okay, or annualized returns, is by using its geometric mean instead of its arithmetic mean. So what is the geometric mean? The arithmetic mean of a bunch of numbers, a plus b plus c, we know is we sum them up and we divide by the number of numbers. The geometric mean of a bunch of numbers is we multiply them together and then take the kth root, okay, of it. Okay? Any questions? Just to play with them, what happens if the numbers are the same? Okay? Suppose we have 10, 10, 10. If all the numbers are the same, okay, how does the arithmetic root mean differ from the geometric mean? Then they're equal. Does everybody see that? Okay? In general, though, they're going to differ. Okay? And in fact, it's always the case that the arithmetic mean is greater than or equal to the geometric mean. Okay? Any questions? So why is it that geometric mean is used to compute, let's say, annualized return? Okay? We're used to dealing with annual returns. Okay? And the basic policy, this is actually kind of has some interesting implications. Because if we take the geometric mean, K years of earning at the annualized return, which is given by the geometric mean, will yield exactly the same payoff as the given time return series. So what does that mean? Suppose, I need to go to a different pen. Suppose I have a stock that 1 year pays me 10% return. The next year it pays me 20% return. Okay? The next year, let's say I lose, okay, 10%. Okay? And so on. Or, let me just get a better pen. Hold on a second. So suppose, let's say, I have a stock that pays me a 5% return 1 year, okay, a 10% return the next year, and a 15% return the next year, okay? After 3 years, okay, what would be my average, what would happen to my money? Okay? The argument would be that if I had multiplied it, if I had started out with S dollars, I would have S times 1.05 then, times 1.10 then, times 1.15 then. Does everybody agree? This would also be equal to S times the cube root, basically if we took the geometric mean of this thing, we took the geometric mean of these things, it would also be the same as S raised to the geometric mean 3 times, multiplied by the geometric mean 3 times. And that's why the geometric mean is the, let's say, interesting, the most accurate way to summarize the investment performance. Any questions? Any questions about what that means? There's some interesting implications of this. If I had a stock, let's say, and I give you a choice of investing in a stock that's going to go up by 1% this year and 100% next year, or one that went up 100% this year and then 1% next year, which would be better? Okay? Is it better to have the growth at the end or at the beginning? Or doesn't it matter? Okay? Think about that. Okay? If I can give you a bunch of returns, does the order of the returns make any difference? Okay? If we believe this analysis that it's just done by multiplying it, the answer is no, because multiplication is commutative, right? Okay? So that's one thing that's interesting here. Okay? Another thing that is interesting is when you hear a mutual fund, I think they call them index funds here, talk about we have an average return of 6.3%. You have to go and ask them very carefully what is it that they mean when they talk about an average return like this, right? If it's done by the geometric mean, it's going to be the accurate rate of what you're going to be doing, right? If it's done by the additive rate return, okay, that's something that they're more likely to give you because of the inequality that says that the arithmetic mean is always greater than or equal to the geometric mean. Everybody here, for advertising purposes, the arithmetic mean is the right one. Okay? For accurate estimation of how your thing is going. Okay? That's the right one. Any question? And if you still don't see that there's a difference between the returns as governed by an arithmetic mean rather than a geometric mean, what would happen if you lost 100% of your money? Okay? You had a return of minus 100%. Okay? When you multiply these things out, that's going to be the equivalent of multiplying by 0. Okay? And so you're completely wiped out. Note that on the other, if you had a hedge fund that earned you 40% for 3 straight years, and then lost 100%, the arithmetic mean will show this as being a positive thing, right? But of course, you've lost all your money. The moment you lost it, that's the end of the game. Any questions? Okay? So that's what we mean by why we care about geometric mean. Any questions? Now, when we deal with multiplying returns, okay, if you think about daily returns are going to be the price of daily returns, okay, would have the property should somehow center around 0. Okay? And dealing with a large number of numbers, multiplying a large number of numbers, let's say around 0. Okay? tend to become, or around 1, tend to be complicated things numerically. Another way to deal with returns is to take the log of the return. Okay? And to take the log of 1 plus the return. That's the log of today's price over yesterday's price. Okay? That has the property, again, that reduces the log of today minus the log of yesterday. Okay? What is good about dealing with logs of returns? First thing is that now the logs of returns are centered around what? Okay? Instead of 1, they're centered around 0. Okay? So now a negative return here would be, is negative. The bigger issue is that if you're dealing with trying to compute returns summed up over a long period of time, if before we had to multiply them, okay, and take roots of it to normalize, if we have reduced our returns to logs, the multi-period representation, okay, is now reduced to summing up logs. Okay? And so it's often easier to deal with the sum of logs than the products of returns. Okay? Any questions? So properties of log returns turn out to be useful and interesting things to deal with. Any questions? Finally, one other, let's say, this issue of when some people talk about measuring returns. Sometimes people measure returns not in terms of an absolute scale, but in terms of an excess scale. Okay? In terms of comparing it to some kind of a baseline. So if you want to talk about, let's say, if you talk about how good an investment strategy is, okay, it's probably not fair to compare it to 0, okay, but to compare it to, let's say, some other reference investment strategy, like what the risk-free rate is, showing that your mutual fund paid off at an average of 6.3% is good, provided the risk-free rate was not 6.2%. Okay? One way to get a fuller representation of how good a particular strategy is often to compare it to a reference. Okay? And when you hear people talk about excess return, that is the difference between one portfolio, okay, basically going long in the asset and short in the reference. Okay? Any questions about that? The reason I mention this is when people talk about investment strategies and things like this, you often hear them mumble the term basis points. Oh, this strategy earned 50 basis points. And what does that mean? That means that they're going to be talking about the excess return, typically relative to another strategy. Okay? Measuring this excess return in 1/100%. That's somehow the unit that is given. Okay? So if somebody hears a strategy and say, oh, I earned 50 basis points on a strategy, what they're probably meaning is something like this. They had a strategy that returned 5.5%. The risk-free rate was 5%. The excess returns would have been 5%. And 5% reduced to 0.100%. Okay? And 0.5% reduced to 100% is 50 basis points. Okay? Any questions? So you recognize that when you hear it. Okay, any questions about what these gross numbers mean, or how we can now take prices and reduce them to these different quantities, be it returns, okay, which are somehow more meaningful numbers to sort of investigate. Any questions? Okay, let's start to look at what happens when we look at real stock returns, okay? Or now that we've got a time series like this, there are certain statistics that are natural to try to compute on time series data. And the most elementary ones are the moments, okay? Okay, which is, we define the nth moment as being, okay? Basically, the deviation from the mean, okay, raised to the nth power. So when people talk about moments of a distribution, the first moment is the arithmetic mean, or the expectation. That's the first statistic that captures something about the property of a distribution or a random variable. The second distribution captures, second moment, which is where we take x minus the mean and square it. That captures our idea of variance. Okay? How much does it deviate? If you have a time series like this, the mean represents the first moment. The deviation represents how much up and down does it go. Okay, how much variation is there. Okay? Those are the most elementary statistics. And those we've talked about before. Two other moments that are interesting are when we raise it to the third power, okay, the deviation from the mean, and we raise it to the third power, okay. The third power, okay, if we raise it to an even power, we get something having that is symmetric, okay, where the sign matters. When we raise it to an even power, the sign of this difference from the mean doesn't matter anymore. If we raise it to the third power, we end up getting a skewness measure, okay? A number that is going to tell us, okay, how much of the mass, okay, is in some sense on each side of the mean, okay? Okay, or how skewed the probability distribution is, okay? If we raise it to the fourth central moment, we get a measure of what the kurtosis is, okay? A measure of how much mass there is away from the mean in the distribution. So let me say this. I think I said this badly. Let me go back again. If we plot now for any kind of a histogram, such as returns, we can get a probability distribution, okay, of what the returns are, okay, as a function of value. So here, if we think about returns as centered around 0, what would we grossly expect? We would grossly expect the amount of positive return. We would expect that the mean return, okay, is probably around 0. We would expect that there is going to be some spread, okay, depending upon whether there will be some spread, and that is somehow the variance that is captured, okay, by the fact that these returns are not always 0. That's what we capture by variance. The skewness is going to capture something about how centrally symmetric is that distribution, okay? In the case of prices data, we might expect, or return data, we might expect it to be centrally symmetric, but that's not always going to be true. It's easier to lose a lot of money in the stock. There's higher probabilities of big losses in the stock market than there are on a daily return basis, than there are of big gains. So we would not expect price return data to be perfectly symmetric, okay? There's going to be some asymmetry between what the curve looks like on the negative side and what it looks like on the positive side. And that would be the statistic measured by skewness. And finally, there is a final statistic which turns out to be more important than skewness for dealing with price data, okay? Which has to do with how closely does this thing resemble a normal distribution in terms of where the mass is distributed. Okay? sometimes we could imagine a distribution where there is more mass distributed further out from the tail, okay, further out from the mean than you would expect in a normal distribution. Okay, that mass has to come from someplace. Okay, so a distribution that differs, if here is, let's say, the normal distribution, a distribution that throws mass in different places than the normal distribution, the way where it shows that place is somehow measured by the kurtosis. Any questions? Okay, so if this was our normal distribution, and we're going to have something that is basically a symmetric bell-shaped curve, but it's not normal, since this is a probability function, the total mass is conserved. It could somehow be pinched in which case there'd be mass out here that lies, the extra, more mass that lies out here than the normal distribution and less over here. Or they could be what we call a leptochoretic. If there's something that has positive kurtosis, it has the property that it's somehow pinched in. So there is actually more mass around the center than there should be in a normal distribution. And also, although you can't see it very well, more mass out by the tails, meaning a higher probability that you will be a certain distance from the mean than you would expect in a normal distribution. Okay? And though that property tends to be exhibited by asset returns. Okay? Any questions? Okay? So what are the properties that you see with asset returns when you start empirically looking at them? Okay? We sort of agree that asset returns should be bell-shaped. But bell-shaped, doesn't necessarily mean it observes a normal distribution. One thing that we would expect is that if we think about stocks, the average daily return is going to be a number that is going to be a small, presumably, is going to have a mean that is slightly greater than 0. Why is it? We expect assets to have a positive return as measured over a year, or else we wouldn't be owning it. Right? But if you have a 10% return divided by 360 days or 52 days, you end up getting a small expected daily drift in return. Okay? We would expect it to be grossly symmetric. Okay, so we expect not much skewness between positive and negative returns. Okay? It turns out that smaller absolute returns we would expect will occur more frequently than larger absolute returns. That's basically just saying that we expect it to be a bell-shaped thing. Okay? That it's more likely there will be small gains than big gains. Okay? Any questions? So, the classic, most important bell-shaped curve is the normal distribution. Okay? When you took a probability class, you were talked about the properties of the normal distribution. This is what it is defined by. That's the probability density function. Okay? The most important aspects of it is not for our purposes the formula, but what it sort of means or how it is interpreted. The thing that is interesting about the normal distribution is that it is parameterized by exactly two things. It is parameterized by a mean, which is where the center is, and it is parameterized by a standard deviation. And what's interesting and exciting about the normal distribution is that somehow the probability density function of what the values are completely given, determined, once you give it a mean and standard deviation. What makes the normal distribution a good thing as far as we're concerned is that it only has two parameters, okay, that reconstructs an entire normal distribution, the entire probability distribution. The other thing is that the probabilities of being a certain distance away from the mean are well understood if you measure distance in terms of standard deviation. Okay? The interesting thing about normal is that 60%, 8% of the time, you are within one standard deviation of the mean. Which means that if you plot sort of one standard deviation away, more than 2/3 of the mass lies within one standard deviation. 95% of the mass lies within two standard deviations. Okay? And it drops off rapidly from there on. Okay? Any questions? This gives us a way to interpret what is the rareness of a particular shift, okay, in value. That's kind of what's the important thing about the normal distribution. Any questions? So one thing that's important when you think about this is that, again, probability of being far from the mean decreases very rapidly. If you look at something, what's the probability of being 4 standard deviations from the mean? Okay, it's 1 in 10,000. What is the probability of being 6 standard deviations from the mean? Okay, you're now talking about something that's on the order of 1 in a million. Okay, how many people have ever heard of the term 6 sigma? Okay, what does 6 sigma mean? Why have you ever heard of that? In what context? In electrical engineering? In industrial engineering. What does that mean? It's a management term or a buzzword measuring a high reliability process, right? So they're trying to say, we want our planes to crash with less than 1 in every million plane crashes. So when people use 6 sigma as a term, what they're trying to say is that it is so that the probability of a defect lies so far from the mean, okay, that the probability is extremely low, and low in this quantifiable way. Any questions? Okay. Now, what things are measured by normal distributions? Okay? Are people's grades and IQs measured by how good a student you are? Is that captured by a normal distribution? In general, we assume that that is true, right? That's why I'm going to curve the grades in here. Okay? In IQs, the central IQ is 100. Okay? If you plot IQs, somehow you expect that to be normally distributed. Human height is something that is normally distributed, right? I don't know what the average height is. Well, certainly it's distributed. There's a male height, average height distribution, and a female height distribution. They're probably different. But you would expect that if you knew what the standard deviation in heights is, and you knew what the average height is, you could know how unusual is it to have someone of a particular height, right? And these quantities are normally distributed. Now, not all quantities are. Let's think about salaries, okay? What would they say is the average salary? Okay, you can certainly compute the average of all those people's salary in the world, okay, or in any context, let's say in Hong Kong. What would the average salary in Hong Kong be? Okay, does anybody have a guess? I don't know, I can't do these calculations. Someone take a guess as to what the average salary is in Hong Kong per year. Okay. I'm going to guess, is it $1 million a year? No, that would be too high, right? Is it $100,000 a year? That's probably a little too low, right? I'm going to guess, right? Let's say it's $200,000. Again, in Hong Kong, anyway, the Hong Kong dollar is worth 1/8 of a US dollar about, okay? Perhaps the mean salary is that. What do we think that the salary distribution looks like? Okay, for in Hong Kong, do we expect it to be bell-shaped? Well, we probably expect it to be somewhat bell-shaped, right? I think that I expect that the probability that somebody is going to be earning less as you move away, the number of people earning less as the salary increases. Certainly it's true, right? So in that sense it's bell-shaped, and the number of people earning much less than this probably decreases. So I do believe that income distribution in Hong Kong is roughly bell-shaped. But is it normal? The answer is no. Why not? The biggest reason is because think about what happens with high-income people. Okay? If we think about, let's say, human height, I am, let's say, about average height. Okay? What is the probability that someone will be twice as tall as me? Small, right? There exists Yao Ming, right? He's twice as tall as me, right? But is there anybody who's 3 times taller than me? The answer is no, right? Now let's think about income. Is there anybody who is going to be making twice as much as the mean? The answer is yes. Is there anybody who's going to be making 3 times as much as the mean? Yes. Okay? Does everybody see that? Okay? Even though that there is a seemingly bell-shaped curve here, this is not a normal distribution. Okay? Exactly what distribution is that monitors income is an interesting question. Okay? Turns out it's a power law is what people say. Okay? We'll talk maybe about that a little bit later. Okay? But we should recognize that some things are normally distributed and some things are not. Okay? And that if we're going to try to model them, it's going to be important that we understand we're going to model things with a normal distribution. It's important to understand what the limits of our accuracy are. Okay? Stock returns certainly can't be completely normal because there is first of all, a lower bound on the returns. In a normal distribution, there is a probability there is somebody 3 times taller than me. It's extremely small though, right? With stock returns, there is an absolute limit to how far it can go on one end. Worst you can do is lose everything. Okay? Whereas on the other end, it is not. So in that sense, the ranges are not symmetric. Okay? If daily returns were normally distributed, we have the problem that the annual returns would not be normally distributed. Why is that? We saw that in some sense the annual returns are the product of daily returns. And the product of a finite number of normal distributions is not normally distributed. Okay? So that's a theoretical reason why we know that daily returns should not be normally distributed. Finally, if we do some experimental analysis and plot time returns, we will see that they don't, although they look bell-shaped, they're not really normal. Okay? Any questions? The model distribution that seems to work best for dealing with stock asset return prices, okay, is the log normal distribution. What does that mean? Okay? We say that it is assumed that the logarithm of the returns, okay, is normally distributed. Okay? What does that mean? Here is an example of the log normal distribution, okay, for a bunch of different variances. Okay? I find that I get confused with this a little bit. First of all, the normal return we picture as being 0, centered around 0, right? So the log of the 0 should be 1. Okay? So we would expect that the log normal distribution would be centered around the value of 1. If we think about what that actually means, though, okay, the shape of the distribution has a lot to do with what the variance of it is. Okay? If we have values that are centered around Okay, if the log is normally distributed, what do we know about the value? Okay, well, if we have a large variance on the values, the log always goes between 0 and a larger number, right? The smallest the value of the log can get is 0. Okay? The largest the value of the log can get is infinite. So by that measure, it's not a symmetric thing. And if you have a process here where the logs of the returns are normally distributed, what you end up getting is that the values of them, okay, are kind of pushed out like this. When you have a high variance, the value of the return can be potentially very large or very small. The smallest the log can be is 0. Okay, so you end up getting a lot of the mass when the variance is high pushed out, and that sort of explains why when the variance is very high, you end up getting a bulge out there. Okay, any questions? Okay. Bottom line is that the log normal distribution is the one that models prices best, okay? And it solves the problem that we had with the, since the sum of a finite number of normal variables, okay, is normal. If we sum up a bunch of daily returns to get a yearly return, okay, the sum of the log returns is still, if that's normal, the sum of the period is also going to be normal. Any questions? Okay, that's the distribution that is used. Now, the trouble is, even if you take a look at the log, say, returns, the returns are log normally distributed. If you empirically compute that, and you see what the actual distributions you get, compared to the log normal distribution, you still see that there is a greater kurtosis than you would expect. There is a higher probability of extreme events. And so there's continual work on trying to find other distributions that more accurately model what is empirically observed in stock prices. Okay? And in general, sometimes people create a mixture of Gaussian distributions where you have one normal distribution that is sampled from with a certain probability, and another normal distribution with a much higher standard deviation that's sampled from occasionally. This kind of mixture of two distributions would have the property that it might better model what stock prices are, but it's kind of a clumsy thing. The more parameters you have, the harder it is to estimate, and the less theoretically pleasing it is to think about this. But the bottom line is just to remember that there are historically observed simulation distributions. They don't completely match log normal, okay? But this is what we will work with. Any questions? And again, this is actually what we've been talking about are things that you can readily observe. You may remember figures like this from when I was when I was talking about my model for predicting price movements as a function of time by using the random walks. If you look at what was happening, if you looked at that kind of a curve, you would see that the actual distribution compared to, let's say, the theoretical distribution was that there were more returns, okay, in the center, near the mean, than we expected, and that there were more returns lying outside, far to one end, than one would expect. This is exactly what we've been sort of saying, okay? That basically the empirical density functions that you observe are taller, skinnier, and wider, okay, than either normal or log normal. Any questions? Okay. Any questions now? Okay, what I'd like to, we've got a couple Okay, first, before we get into this, let's take a question. Are there any questions about the homework assignment? Okay? For first homework assignment is due a week from now. Has anybody started working on it? Okay? Nobody has started. Okay? So I don't know if there's any questions about that now. But I encourage you to at least start it, looking at it enough to answer questions for next time. Any questions? Okay? I also encourage people to come by at the end of class to talk about. I have the project proposals. I want to pass them out, okay, and make sure people see them. Any questions? Okay. What I'd like to talk about now, just quickly, just for both because it's fun and because we have a few minutes left, okay, has to do with the question of how do you visualize time series, okay, and statistical data. Okay, and this is we're going to talk in the next couple classes about models for time series. I'm going to get into some more technical stuff. But one of the first things that's important to do whenever you have a time series data, okay, is to properly visualize it. And usually when people talk about visualizing it, they talk about plugging it into Excel and producing a graph. You should be aware that there are good ideas, good design principles for mathematical graphics, okay? And one thing I strongly recommend everybody do, okay, just for fun, it may not be for the course, is you read some books by a guy named Edward Tufted on graphic design, okay? He has made a career out of trying to show how to, let's say, represent data in ways that you can really make sense of it. And these have been some of the most meaningful books that I have ever read in my life. They have lots of pictures, okay? But more than that, pictures about how do you understand data. And if you look at enough good mathematical graphics, you get some kind of an idea as to how you can do it. You learn that the importance of sort of minimizing what is not data in a graph. You learn the importance of meaningfully labeling axes and avoiding what we would call clutter in a graph. Because we have a couple minutes, what I'd like to do is just show you a couple of graphics and show you a little bit of a difference between good and bad ways of presenting time series data so you can understand it. One thing that he's made a career of is taking data that other people publish and show how bad their presentation was, okay? And that what was sort of shown by the data isn't clear unless you visualize it right. Here is a data set that was proudly published by, I believe it's the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the United States, right? Okay. On what were cancer survival rates. So suppose you were just diagnosed with cancer, okay? One of the first things you're going to want to know now is what are your chances of survival for a period of time, right? Does that make sense? Okay? So here, what your doctor would say is, well, here, go to these PowerPoint slides that they publish, showing you what your cancer rate is, okay? And what is this data set? You may say, well, it's a good graph. It was produced from Excel, okay? But what is it trying to show you? It says here this is 0 year. This is showing as a function of how long do you live. 0, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Okay? What percentage of people survive from different cancer rates? Right? If you had thyroid cancer, your probability of surviving 1 year is this, 5 years is that, and so on. And they present this to you for all kinds of different cancers. Here's 4 of the cancers. Here's 4 more: bladder cancer. Here's a more complicated set of cancers, so they show it in a 3-dimensional plot. Okay? I assure you, if you look at this, you couldn't understand it. One thing that Tufte did was instead take all that data and reduce it to this plot. What is this plot showing you? Okay? It's showing you estimates of survival percentages. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Per cancer, okay? So you see that somehow, what cancer do you want to have? Anyone want to pick a guess? Okay? Let's say cancer of the larynx. Okay? Your survival rate was 68% after 5 years. Okay? 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years. He has this thing reduced to sort of nice, simple time series. Okay? He has the time series sorted by highest 5-year survival. So you can learn which cancer you want to get. Okay? Because this one has a higher 5-year survival than the other one. And what the point of this is, if you take a look at this slide, okay, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Looking at the data presented in this way, it is clear how to make sense out of it. Okay? Whereas the other, let's say, standard representation, okay, the first representation isn't anywhere near as easy to see. You see that he's got color being used in funny ways, and shape being used in funny ways, okay, and inhomogeneous plots being used in funny ways. Over the next couple of classes, we're going to talk about time series data, okay, and we'll talk about how to analyze it. One of the first things to do is to worry about plotting it right. And so I encourage you all to go see if you can get a hold of some of Edward Duffy's books and just look at it, just to get a sense of this kind of thing. Any questions? Okay. In that case, I'd like to say thanks for attention. I'm going to pass back now, as people, since there's only 7, I encourage people to come up here and just take it as it. I graded everybody's project presentation proposal. Okay? I didn't grade, but a very strong gradation on it. I had a few that I thought were very good. They were more detailed. A few I said were good plus. Don't worry about the distinction. The main thing to worry about is to look at the comments I wrote on it and to come by and talk to me to make sure that we understand and can point you in the right direction on your projects. Any questions? Okay, thanks for your attention, and we'll continue on with this next class.